The 3rd of January 32 BC, the scorching sun beats down on the Levantine coast, and the Mediterranean sea breeze sweeps across the land of Phoenicia, carrying a faint salty scent. Imagine this. At this moment you are standing on the shimmering shore alongside 30,000 exhausted but highly spirited Macedonian soldiers. Looking as far as the eye can see, right in front of you, nearly a kilometer from the mainland coast in the deep Azure Sea, stands a magnificent city. It has no bridge connecting it to the land, no shallows to wade across. Surrounding it is only the deep, churning open sea. Even more despairing is that its walls, built from massive stone blocks, rise directly from sea level, towering majestically over 40 meters into the air, like a rocky behemoth lurking in the abyss. Over the past few centuries, Assyrian chariots, Babylonian iron cavalry, and countless conquerors who looked down upon the world have all smashed their heads bloody against this high wall. The Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II once spent 13 full years laying siege here, only to ultimately retreat in dismal defeat. This is Tyre, the wealthiest and most impregnable island fortress of the ancient world. To the proud Tyrians, their city is invincible. It is a miracle designed purely for defense against naval attacks. Land-based infantry phalanxes are helpless against it. But today, the man standing on the coastline is named Alexander. At only 24 years old, having just crushed the invincible army of the Persian Empire on the battlefield, he intends to use an unprecedented method to prove to the Tyrians and to the whole world in Alexander's dictionary the word unreachable does not exist. Under his command is an elite, ever victorious army of 30,000. But he faces a fatal shortcoming. He simply does not have a fleet sufficient to launch a cross-sea amphibious assault. According to all the established laws of ancient warfare, Alexander's path of conquest should end here. Facing this island guarded jointly by tens of thousands of able-bodied men and the most powerful navy in the eastern Mediterranean, the most rational choice seems to be bypassing it. But if you know Alexander, you will know what kind of madness will unfold here over the next 6 months. The ocean will be filled in, giant siege towers 50 meters high will cross the waves, and the once arrogant island will be forcibly dragged back into the embrace of the mainland. To understand why Alexander was so obsessed with this seemingly bypassable isolated island, we must turn our gaze to the broader strategic chessboard and look at the general trend of the world in 332 BC. Just 1 year earlier, in 333 BC, Alexander achieved an earth-shattering victory at the Battle of Issus. Darius III, the Persian Empire's King of Kings, hastily abandoned his mother, wife, and baggage train, fleeing into the heartland of his empire. At that time, the entire Macedonian army was jubilant, and many generals suggested immediately marching east to strike directly at the Persian capital and capture Darius alive. But Alexander was not blinded by this fleeting victory. He refused to advance blindly. Although Darius was defeated, he still possessed massive mobilization capabilities in the vast interior. Even more fatal was that Alexander now faced a looming and massive hidden danger, the navy of the Persian Empire. Alexander abruptly turned the spearhead of his grand army southward, marching along the Levantine coast into Phoenicia. His strategic objective was extremely clear. He had to completely sever all of the Persian Empire's tentacles in the Mediterranean before advancing deep inland. At that time, the Phoenician coast was dotted with several prosperous states facing Alexander, who was at the height of his power. Most cities chose to play it safe. Byblos in the north surrendered without a fight. The bustling city of Sidon threw its gates wide open, hailing Alexander as the liberator who freed them from the Persian yoke. The coastline was opening up to the Macedonians without any hindrance. But there was one city that watched all this coldly and refused to follow suit. That was Tyre. Tyre was dangerous, not merely because of its towering walls, but even more so because of the intangible assets it controlled. At this very moment, the surviving main force of the Persian navy was using it as a base to assemble. Damaged Persian warships were being repaired in Tyre's excellent harbors. Tens of thousands of crewmen were training, stockpiling supplies, and finding sanctuary here. Tyre was the most powerful naval heart of the eastern Mediterranean. As long as Tyre did not fall, the Persian Empire still had a foothold on the sea. It meant that the Persian fleet could launch amphibious attacks behind the Macedonian army at any time. It meant they could easily sever the maritime supply lines Alexander depended on for survival. It meant, above all, that they could sail to the Greek peninsula with vast amounts of Persian gold, inciting city-states like Sparta to rebel and igniting the flames of war in Alexander's deep rear. Alexander's attack on Tyre was by no means to satisfy personal vanity or competitiveness. He had to conquer this place because his grand endeavor of the Eastern campaign, and even the life and death of his entire army, were completely tied to the ownership of this coast. Tyre was the inevitable path leading to the throne of the king of the world. In the spring of 332 BC, the sea breeze was still slightly chilly. Alexander was well aware of the difficulties in storming an island. Initially, he did not reveal his murderous intent, but instead attempted to take the city without shedding a drop of blood through a game of politics and religion. He sent an envoy of the highest level to Tyre, making a request that seemed humble, but was actually full of hidden motives. Alexander hoped to be granted permission to enter the city of Tyre to make a sacrifice at the temple of Melkort. Melkort was the supreme patron deity of Tyre, and in Greek mythology they equated Melkort with Hercules. And the Macedonian Argead dynasty, to which Alexander belonged, had always prided itself as the direct descendants of Hercules. On the surface, this was a pious religious visit, but behind it lay a cruel political subtext. In the traditions of the ancient Near East, only the legitimate ruler or supreme suzerain of the city was qualified to perform the highest level of sacrifice in the main temple. If the Tyrians opened their gates and allowed Alexander to sacrifice, it would be equivalent to legally recognizing his absolute hegemony as the king of Asia. The rulers of Tyre were not foolish. They saw through Alexander's political trick at a glance. They arrogantly replied. Tyre would remain neutral in the war between Macedonia and Persia if Alexander wished to sacrifice. There was an ancient temple of Melkort in the ruins of old Tyre on the mainland, and he was welcome to go there. But no Macedonian would ever be allowed to step foot in the main island city of Tyre. Alexander was enraged, but he still restrained himself and issued a final ultimatum, urging them to pull back from the brink. However, what the Tyrians did next completely severed the last sliver of possibility for peace. Relying on the vast ocean and impregnable high walls, the Tyrians believed they had nothing to fear. Not only did they detain the envoys Alexander sent to negotiate, but at the highest point of the city walls, in full view of the entire Macedonian army on the shore, they brutally executed these sacred messengers who enjoyed diplomatic immunity. Subsequently, they tossed the corpses of the envoys from the 40-meter high walls into the turbulent Mediterranean Sea like discarded trash. That dull splash became the death knell for the Tyrian Empire. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a blatant provocation to the military prestige of Macedonia and the ultimate trampling of Alexander's dignity. Standing on the shore, a cold, ruthless fury burned in Alexander. Sighs, he swore a deadly oath to the sea and the gods. This overbearing city would inevitably be ground to dust beneath his feet. At the time, almost no one believed this frivolous vow could be fulfilled. Anger did not strip Alexander of his reason. As a genius commander, he immediately and soberly assessed the dilemma before him. First, he could not use scaling ladders to climb walls, that grew directly out of the deep sea. Second, he could not rely on a prolonged siege to starve out the city's inhabitants, as Persian and Carthaginian merchant ships could still continuously transport grain to Tyre by water. Third, his pitiful handful of Macedonian ships was absolutely unqualified to challenge Tyre's massive and battle-hardened navy. Since all conventional tactics were ineffective, Alexander made a crazy decision that subverted all the norms of ancient warfare. If the ocean protects the city, then I will push the land to the city's feet. Centuries ago, the ancestors of the Tyrians did not live on the island. Their original settlement, known as Old Tyre Rushu, was situated on the mainland coast. Later, to escape the ravages of war, they moved the city to the island and rose to prominence on the sea. Now, the magnificent ruins of Old Tyre still lay scattered along the coastline, abandoned by time and forgotten by the world. Alexander issued a jaw-dropping order: demolish Old Tyre. Tens of thousands of Macedonian soldiers laid down their spears and shields, picking up pickaxes and ropes. Instead, they transformed into the most efficient demolition army, prying out the massive stone blocks from the ruins of Old Tyre piece by piece. They felled premium cedar wood from the Lebanon mountains to serve as piling foundations, driven into the seabed. Rocks, dirt, and the wreckage of ruins were continuously transported to the seaside by wheelbarrows and manpower and dumped into the churning seawater. Gradually, what emerged on the sea surface was no longer a simple road, but a broad cross-sea causeway. A historic path, built from the ruins of Tyre's own ancestors, was miraculously extending toward the deep water. The soldiers toiled from dawn to dusk under the scorching sun, their sweat intertwining with the seawater. However, as the causeway continuously pushed forward, the depth of the seawater increased sharply, and the engineering difficulty rose exponentially. Even more terrifying, the head of the causeway began to enter the effective lethal range of the archers and ballistae on the Tyrian walls. Construction instantly turned into a bloody battle where flesh and blood flew. Dense arrows and deadly stone projectiles rained down like a torrential storm from the 40-meter-high walls. At the same time, Tyre's light warships closed in on both sides of the causeway, like a pack of wolves, shooting at the defenseless Macedonian laborers from close range. To protect the laborers, Alexander ordered the construction of two giant wooden siege towers, Helipolius reaching 50 meters in height at the end of the causeway. To prevent fire attacks, the bodies of the towers were covered with raw oxides. Massive Macedonian torsion catapults and ballistae were hoisted onto the siege towers. They let out deafening roars as they hurled heavy stone projectiles at enemy ships on the sea and the distant city walls. Every stone pushed forward on the causeway was accompanied by the price of blood. This colossal project had already consumed a tremendous amount of time, materials, and human lives. The political and morale losses brought about by abandoning it far exceeded the cost of continuing construction. Alexander understood that this was a point of no return. Once the construction of the causeway began, this siege was left with only two outcomes. Either Tyre would be breached and destroyed, or the Macedonian army would bleed its last drop of blood in this quagmire. When the Macedonian causeway stubbornly advanced into the deep water, just a stone's throw away from the island, the Tyrians, feeling unprecedented survival pressure, launched their meticulously planned fatal counterattack. They knew well that they absolutely could not let those two terrifying siege towers get close to the walls. The Tyrians found a massive old horse transport ship and transformed it into a horrifying superweapon, a fire ship. The hold was piled high with highly combustible dry branches, pitch, sulfur, and other highly flammable chemical substances. They erected two towering masts at the bow, from which they suspended giant cauldrons filled with oil. Even more brilliantly, to ensure the fireship could raise its bow before impact for maximum contact area with the siege towers, they piled heavy ballast stones at the stern. One day, taking advantage of a strong sea wind blowing straight toward the causeway, Tyrian death squads boarded this ship of doom. They rowed with all their might, pushing the fireship's speed to the limit. When they were only a few steps away from the Macedonian siege towers, the crew ignited the fierce fire. Then, one after another, jumped into the sea and swam back to safety. The uncontrolled fireship, like a roaring fire dragon, carrying the momentum of a thunderbolt, viciously smashed into the wooden siege towers at the end of the causeway. The oil cauldrons suspended on the masts shattered with a crash, pouring boiling oil over the towers, and roaring flames instantly engulfed the wooden frameworks covered in raw oxides. Flames shot into the sky, and thick smoke obscured the sun. The 50-meter-high siege towers let out blood, curdling, cracking sounds amidst the raging inferno, ultimately collapsing with a crash and plunging into the boiling seawater. At the same time, the Tyrian warships swarmed out, taking advantage of the chaos to massacre the Macedonians on the causeway and set fire to the siege engines that had not yet been affected. In just a few tens of minutes, the engineering miracle that Macedonian soldiers had built over months with blood, sweat, and even their lives was reduced to a scorched ruin. The Macedonian army on the shore witnessed this scene, and their morale suffered a devastating blow. The siege seemed to have fallen into a suffocating dead end. Looking at the floating wreckage and burning embers on the sea, Alexander finally and painfully recognized a cruel reality. This would absolutely not be a quick conquest achieved through surprise attacks and fanaticism. It would be a meat grinder of a war of attrition, and the previous months were merely a warm-up. The soaring flames of the fireship illuminated the essence of the Tyrian campaign. Relying solely on land engineering could never conquer Tyre, as long as this city still firmly held naval supremacy. It could receive reinforcements and supplies from the sea at any time and defend itself indefinitely. Without a powerful naval force to sever its maritime lifeline, this siege was doomed to end in a complete Macedonian failure. After experiencing this bitter setback, Alexander demonstrated the strategic flexibility that earned him the title, the Great. Since the city could not be breached without a fleet, he would go and conjure up a fleet. He temporarily handed the reconstruction of the causeway over to his deputies, while he personally led a unit of elites to leave the camp and head for the Phoenician coastal cities that had already submitted to him, seeking a way to break the deadlock. Turning points in history often appear in the most desperate moments. At this time, the geopolitical map of the Middle East was undergoing violent tectonic shifts. To show its loyalty to Alexander, the city of Sidon provided a large number of experienced sailors and warships. Upon hearing of Darius's disastrous defeat, the kings of Byblos and Aradus immediately abandoned the Persian Empire and submitted to Alexander, bringing along their elite warships anchored offshore. With these timely reinforcements, Alexander quickly cobbled together a fleet of about 80 warships. Although this was already a force not to be underestimated, it still lacked a decisive, overwhelming advantage when facing Tyre's well-equipped and highly trained main fleet. But good fortune seemed to always favor this young conqueror. The kings of Cyprus, who had been watching from the sidelines, made a wise historical choice after thoroughly confirming the tilt in the balance of power following the Battle of Iessis. They announced the withdrawal of all support for the Persian Empire and personally led a mighty armada of 120 heavy warships into Levantine waters to join Alexander's command. Even the island of Rhodes sent warships to assist. In just a few weeks, the size of the fleet gathered under Alexander's command skyrocketed like a snowball, with the total number exceeding 220 ships. He instantly transformed from an army commander, without a single rowboat, into a naval overlord possessing absolute maritime supremacy in the region. When Alexander, aboard his flagship, led this massive and invincible fleet, composed of Phoenicians and Cypriots back into Tyrian waters in a sky-blotting crescent formation. The Tyrians on the walls fell into a deathly silence. They had thought Alexander was at his wit, his end, but they never expected to be greeted by a torrent of maritime steel capable of crushing everything. Faced with absolute numerical suppression, the Tyrian fleet wisely abandoned naval combat and retreated to hunker down in their harbors. What was originally a one-dimensional land siege now evolved into a three-dimensional sea and land strangulation. After seizing naval supremacy, Alexander mercilessly tightened the noose. The city of Tyre had two main ports, the Sidonian port in the north and the Egyptian port in the south. Alexander split his massive fleet in two. The Cypriot fleet blockaded the northern port, while the Phoenician fleet blockaded the southern port, establishing an airtight formal naval blockade. Unwilling to sit and wait for death, the Tyrians responded with extremely brilliant naval sorties. They attempted to use terrain and wind advantages to break the encirclement. Fierce boarding actions erupted in the narrow waters. This was no longer a phalanx advance on land, but a bloody meat grinder of battering rams and hand-boarding combat. Heavy bronze rams tore through the wooden hulls of enemy ships amidst the waves, sending wood splinters and seawater flying together. Ballistae and bows fired at each other at point-blank range, the howling sound of armor being pierced, sending chills down the spine. Giant oars snapped in the violent collisions. Macedonian and Phoenician boarding parties, wielding short swords and battle axes, leaped across the narrow gaps between ships to engage in bloody melee combat on the slippery decks. After several rounds of brutal attrition, Tyre's surviving navy was completely suppressed. The Macedonian fleet took complete control of all waters surrounding Tyre. To support the siege, Alexander ordered large warships to anchor extremely close to the city walls and mounted heavy siege engines on the ships. The Tyrians immediately counterattacked by sending out extremely brave free divers. These underwater assassins dove into the deep sea like ghosts and used sharp daggers to sever the thick hemp rope anchor cables of the Macedonian warships, causing the ships to lose their moorings and collide with each other in the waves. Faced with this hard-to-prevent sabotage, Alexander displayed his genius engineering intuition. He ordered all rope anchor cables to be replaced with heavy iron chains. The Tyrian divers were left helpless against the cold. Hard iron chains, and the last loophole in the sea blockade was sealed. From that moment on, Tyre was completely cut off from all contact with the outside world. This once bustling and prosperous world-class port had turned into a dead city of despair. While naval supremacy changed hands, the nature of the siege underwent a fundamental reversal. On the mainland, the sea causeway that had once been devoured by fire was rebuilt. This time, it was constructed wider, higher, and stronger to prevent the Tyrians from repeating their old trick. A dense defensive net was deployed at the front end of the causeway. Alexander advanced his most massive heavy legion artillery positions to the very end of the causeway. Giant catapults and stone throwers roared day and night, pouring tons of massive stones and incendiary projectiles onto Tyre's walls and into the city, forcing the defenders on the walls to retreat from exposed positions to seek cover. Brand new giant siege towers, like moving mountains, advanced slowly and unstoppably. Although the Tyrians still fought desperately on the walls, using various barbed hooks, hot sand, and nets of fire to block the Macedonians, attempts to scale the walls, resulting in the frontal assault from the causeway, failing to achieve a decisive breakthrough. A deadly killing intent was brewing out on the sea. The survival pressure within the walls was approaching its critical point. The desperate Tyrians even built secondary wooden towers on the battlements of the walls, frantically firing flaming arrows at the assault ships on the sea. Alexander, S response was cold and efficient. He converted some of the heavy attack ships into seaborne elevating battering rams, under the covering fire of warships on both sides. These behemoths slowly approached the southern section of Tyre's walls. Amidst the rising and falling waves, the massive iron-clad rams began their tedious yet deadly work. Thud, 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 time and time again. The heavy cast iron, carrying immense kinetic energy, viciously struck Tyre's ancient stone walls. This was no longer an aimless probe. Alexander was precisely constricting the pressure, searching for his prey's most vulnerable weak point like a cold-blooded surgeon. Ultimately, Alexander poured all the heavy pressure onto a weak point in the south wall. More and more seaborne rams converged here, braving the defenders' rain of arrows. The ramming continued for several full days, with each strike accompanied by cries of despair from within the city. On a crisp morning in the 3rd of August 32 BC, an extremely dull sound of cracking echoed across the sea and sky. Immediately following it was the exhilarating, deafening roar of a collapse. A broad section of the wall finally could no longer withstand months of physical destruction and collapsed with a crash, kicking up clouds of dust that filled the sky. A massive breach appeared in the defensive line. Alexander did not waste even a single second of this tactical opportunity. Assault ships carrying the most elite infantry immediately charged toward the breach, like arrows released from a bowstring. Accompanied by the turning of winches, the heavy boarding bridges slammed heavily onto the shattered stone structures. Without the slightest hesitation, Alexander, as always, led from the very front, holding a shield and brandishing his sharp sword alongside his most loyal hypaspists, shield bearers. He trampled over ruins and corpses, braved the desperate rain of arrows, and was the first to charge into the breach of the wall. The battle entered a white-hot state in an instant. The breach was extremely narrow, and soldiers from both sides engaged in slaughter almost face to face. The Tyrian defenders knew what the fall of the city meant. They erupted with the fanaticism of cornered beasts, desperately blocking the breach with their own flesh and refusing to retreat even half a step. But as more and more well-armored, highly trained Macedonian heavy infantry forcefully squeezed into the breach, the Tyrian defensive line began to collapse. At the same time, at the northern and southern ends of the city, Phoenician and Cypriot triremes took advantage of the emptied city defenses, forced open the port's defensive chains with a do-or-die momentum, and flooded into the city like a burst dam, completely cutting off the defenders' reinforcement routes to the south wall. The south wall collapsed entirely. This invincible maritime fortress completely opened its gates to the conqueror. The fall of the walls did not bring the slaughter to a halt. Instead, it raised the curtain on an even bloodier prologue. The fighting spread from the walls to every corner of the city. House-to-house searches and purges, street-to-street bloodbaths, and even parkour-style slaughter from rooftop to rooftop. The Macedonian soldiers, suppressed for 7 full months, saw completely red with bloodlust. They wanted revenge for their fallen comrades on the causeway, revenge for the envoys thrown into the sea. Tyre paid an unimaginably tragic price for its arrogant resistance. In the street fighting on the day the city fell, over 8,000 Tyrian soldiers and citizens were ruthlessly massacred, their blood dyeing the city's streets and the surrounding seawater red. Except for a few royals and dignitaries who fled into the Temple of Melkort to seek sanctuary and were pardoned by Alexander, the surviving 30,000 women, children, and artisans in the city were all put in shackles and sold into slavery as spoils of war, their wealth filling the treasury of the Macedonian expeditionary force. The most chilling retaliation occurred in the days that followed. Along the desolate coastline, 2,000 young and able-bodied Tyrian prisoners of war who had participated in the defense were ordered by Alexander to be crucified. 2,000 Agonizingly twisted corpses swayed in the Levantine sea breeze. This was a horrifying monument, erected by Alexander to declare to the whole world the fate of those who resist. But not everyone met with death. Those cities that wisely chose to bow their heads in the early stages of the war were spared. The citizens of Sidon were completely unharmed, and the merchant ships of Byblos continued to sail. Under Alexander's hegemonic system, submission remained the only passport to survival. Month siege of Tyre came to a close. The Tyrians learned the terrifying cost of defying the Macedonian military edge and the entire Mediterranean, and even the ancient world also learned a despairing new lesson. In this world, there is no city, no natural barrier that Alexander the Great cannot reach. The coastline behind the Macedonian Grand Army was completely cleared. The Persian navy lost its last home port and ultimately collapsed without a fight. Alexander rested briefly, then continued to march his army south. En route, the city of Gaza attempted to emulate Tyre in a final resistance, only to be mercilessly wiped off the map 2 months later. Subsequently, ancient Egypt opened its doors to this unstoppable conqueror, and Alexander was crowned pharaoh by the priests in Memphis, becoming a living demigod. By this point, the naval supremacy of the entire eastern Mediterranean had fallen completely into his hands. His long, vital maritime supply line was absolutely safe and secure, and there were no longer any hidden dangers in his rear. But this was merely the prelude to this epic expedition. The war was far from over. In the distant eastern hinterlands, Darius was still alive, and the vast and ancient Persian Empire still stood tall. Now, having lost the entire Mediterranean coastline, the empire had been driven into a corner. Darius made a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble, summoning all the remaining resources within the empire's borders. A super army hailing from all parts of Asia, composed of hundreds of different ethnic groups, was assembling. Tens of thousands of heavy cavalry, sky-blotting infantry phalanxes, terrifying scythe chariots. The Persian Empire pressed its entire national destiny and weight onto the open expanses of the Mesopotamian plains. That young commander who had just broken all the rules of land and sea in ancient warfare was about to collide head-on with the ultimate counterattack of the entire empire.